Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with Peter Coleman. Peter's a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at Teachers College and the Earth Institute. Peter has a bachelor's from the University of Iowa. He has an MPhil from Columbia and a PhD from Columbia University. He is well published. He's published well over 100 articles and chapters. He's a member of the UN Mediation Support Unit Academic Advisory Council, and he is also a well-known expert on constructive conflict resolution and sustainable peace. His current research focuses on conflict intelligence and systemic wisdom as meta-competencies for navigating conflict constructively across all levels, and has many interactions with many nations to try and find multicultural conflict to cease and to find some type of sustainable peace. He is the first recipient of the Early Career Award from the American Psychological Association in 2003. He is the author of many books, and his most recent one, The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, is what we discuss in this conversation. We start out by talking about how we define toxic polarization and what makes this period that we're living in pretty unique for that. We talk about aspects of in-group versus out-group and why dialogue is important. We talk about the idea of attractors, and he gives some overview and history of the importance of Kurt Lewin's field theory. We talk about his 5-factor model of the way out, which is reset, bolster, complexity, movement, and adapt. We talk about how we can use complexities to have dialogue with others. And we talk about how people can fix polarization individually and at scale, and many other topics. Peter was a great person to have this conversation with. Obviously, people talk about toxic polarization and political polarization, social polarization in society at the moment. And he's been doing this work for some time, both domestically and really just globally. And he was wonderful to get many of his ideas and many of his various experiences around the world. And so now I bring you Peter Coleman. I'm here with Peter Coleman. Peter, it's very nice of you to come on the podcast. I greatly appreciate it.
Xavier, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, no, wonderful. So tell listeners just a little bit about who you are, what you do, what you study, and your new book that's come out.
Sure. So I am a professor of psychology and education at Teachers College and at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and I run a couple of research centers there, mostly that study conflict resolution, and one that focuses more on sustainably peaceful societies. And I study particularly the extremes of those. I studied long-term difficult, what we call intractable conflicts that get stuck in families and communities and in nations for, sometimes decades or more, and the conditions where they end. And then I also lead a research team that studies sustainably peaceful societies. We're interested in understanding how societies, which there are hundreds of around the world, manage to maintain peace internally and, regionally and then internationally, sometimes for 50, 100, couple of hundred years, and what makes them resilient. So those are the two extremes I study. I'm trained as a social psychologist, and I wrote a book recently called The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. I wrote this book because I felt that there was a lot of well-intentioned work taking place on the ground, trying to bring, red and blue Americans or people who are polarized across some ideological divide together in conversation. But I felt that there was a serious misunderstanding of the science. So I wanted to write about, my understanding of the science, nature of the problem that we're facing, and a little bit about what to do about it to escape it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I've read the book, The Way Out. It's very good. It's rich with content, and you have a really nice kind of, way out. You have a nice formula of how to try and overcome some of the polarization that we feel. So I imagine a large part of our conversation will deal with political elements, but I understand as reading the book that it's not just politics. It has to deal with this, conflict in general or polarization in general, but obviously politics is something that comes up pretty often.
I think that's true. I mean, I think particularly today, the political divides, for example, around Trump or masks or, vaccination mandates trickle down into people's personal lives. And so families are divided and communities are divided. So sometimes these political issues become much more pervasive and troublesome in that way. But yes, I think the ideas from the research have relevance for, tensions across racial groups or religious groups or other types of ethnic groups that are in dispute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, polarization is something that a lot of people talk about nowadays. Obviously, we had in the United States, we had the election last year. We had more recently an election in a few states this year, and then we have the midterms next year. So there's always an election going on, and usually there's always some kind of discussion about polarization. And I guess just to kind of start off with some of the stuff you talk about in the book is, what would you say are the current problems? So let me just spell this out a little bit. People talk about polarization, but what do they mean by that, politically and otherwise, socially, racially? And then how is it different now in the second decade of the 21st century as opposed to other periods in the United States history or maybe global history?
Yeah, good question. So political polarization in particular is not necessarily a bad thing. In a two-party system like ours, it's good to have passionate, informed people that are coming at problems and solutions and policies from very different perspectives, being fairly far apart, as long as kind of the overarching framework is constructive, is cooperative, and they're trying to solve problems. What we're currently experiencing is something I call toxic polarization. It's a state that in some ways is like an addiction. It's like a biopsychosocial structural problem that we get sucked into. And it is a multi-decade problem in that our tensions between us and them, sort of red and blue Americans, have been growing for decades, since probably the early to mid 1970s. And this is by many measures. There are a lot of different types of measures of polarization. Oftentimes people, when they talk about polarization, they're talking about what they call affective polarization, which is the degree of warmth that you feel for your group, your in-group, and the degree of sort of hate or contempt or frustration you feel towards members of another group. And that has been, the measures of that have been increasing really again since the 70s. But you see polarization manifest in other ways. You see it in Washington, D.C. with the inability for our Congress to come together and pass bipartisan legislation. It's very, it's less and less common. And that too is a long trajectory. But you see it in physically people moving away from each other, reds moving away from blues and vice versa. This is not only the sort from rural, between rural and urban areas, but also within cities. You see people move into pockets in neighborhoods that are, much more red and much more blue, so that we don't have to have contact with them. And when that happens, when there is, a physical separation, there's a separation also on the internet. We get sorted or sort ourselves into our tribes. But when that happens, psychologically in our communication structures, it really sets up a time where there is a phenomenon that we call autistic hostility, where you don't really talk to them anymore. You have very little direct contact. And so we ruminate about how awful they are, how threatening they are. And that's part of the escalation that happens. So that's one of the most concerning things, because it's that lack of contact between groups that oftentimes sets the conditions for violence. There's a study in India between Hindu and Muslim violence that looked at the kind of structures of the places, the social structures of the places that were more and less violent. And when you have large groups of people that live near each other, but have very little contact with each other, that's when intergroup conflict can escalate and get out of control and be extremely difficult. So historically, what's interesting or what's concerning, I think, to me, is that some historians like John Meacham and Doris Kearns Goodwin have been talking about parallels between today and the 1850s in America, which was just before our Civil War. They suggest that several of the conditions are very similar. We have a sort of secessionist movement. We have a contested election or set of elections. And we have, extreme vitriol against the other side that is fed by massive disinformation campaigns. Mm-hmm. And that combination of things, of course, you also have a country with 400 million guns now. Mm-hmm. And frankly, most of those are on the right. I think 80% of those guns are supposedly on the right. So we're a heavily armed, heavily angry nation that's fed a lot of propaganda, where a lot of the extreme voices, particularly in social media, but also on some mainstream media, control the discourse. So we think the other side is much more threatening than they are. We think their attitudes are much more extreme than they are. And that elicits in us fear and more extremism. And so we're in this kind of runaway train, which, January 6th was a glimpse into what could be. And there's great concern that that will happen again. After Obama was elected, hate groups increased by 755%. And while Trump was in office, they increased another 55%, another 50%. So, there are growing levels of political violence, political enmity and animosity, and ultimately hate groups, which are kind of extreme manifestations of that. And that's a dangerous recipe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's something that we're all kind of observing, and I think a lot of people are wondering, well, what the hell's going on, and how do we get here, and then how do we get out of it, which we'll get to in a sec. But I had a conversation with Dominic Packer and his co-author Jay Van Bavel. They wrote this book, The Power of Us. You may have heard of it, and they talked about how not only is group identities is what they kind of focus on. Not only is the fact of this, people are aligning with a particular group, right? So here's my echo chamber. Here's the side I'm for. Here's the team I'm on, or whatever. Yeah. But it's also, and now I'm against this other team, or we're going to coalesce against someone else or this other group. So it's not just, because I think historically it was, well, I'm part of this group, or this is my tribe, or this is, whatever. I don't really care what anybody else does, and that's fine, or whatever. But now the volume keeps increasing because I'm on this team and I have to be very vehemently against the other side or the other team, and which is, I think, a main point, something you talk about in the book too, is what's causing more of the toxicity, right? It's not just polarization, but it's that toxicity of the being part of whatever your group you're in, and then also against another group or groups as well.
Yeah, the social scientists call that zero-sum identities, when the core of your identity starts to become that I am fundamentally not you, right? Yeah, I'm not a radical socialist, or I'm not an insane Trumper. Mm-hmm. And when you define yourself at your core as not them, mm-hmm. that leads to, again, feelings of contempt and worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Just one thing before we get to attractors, because this is a big thing that you talk about in the book, is you talk about this piece early on, and it kind of comes throughout the book, which is this idea of dialogue, which you describe as a process of open and reflective speaking, hearing, learning, and discovery that's unfamiliar to most of us. Yeah. And, I have to say, part of that's something I strongly agree with. That's something that I try to do on this podcast and just in general, is not trying to have arguments or debates or fights with people, but sincere dialogue, which means you have to go and listen to the other person and hear what they have to say, and putting yourself in those environments. And I guess this might be jumping ahead, but why, I guess, aside from the tribal pieces of things or the in-group, out-group kind of identity things, why is the dialogue component so difficult for people? Is it confirmation bias? Is it a lot of just kind of discrimination that people have towards one person from another? Is it not enough motivation or incentives? Why is there this kind of resistance for many people to just have dialogue with other people that are different from them?
I would say it's cultural. I mean, in some ways, dialogue is countercultural. We, as Americans and Westerners, believe in the power of debate, and we're trained in debate. Many of us in high school, we see our politicians do it, we see lawyers do it, we see it in courts, we see it on television. So we're really raised in the sea of debate, and so we assume that when there is a difference that matters between you and me, and it can be just a small conflict, or it can be an ideological or political difference, we assume that debate is the way to go, right? So we move immediately into debate, which in my view is, generally speaking, more of a competitive game. Debate is about me winning an argument. Mm-hmm. And I do listen to you, and I listen to you carefully, but I listen to you in a particular way where I'm looking for flaws in your logic that I can weaponize to win the game. Mm-hmm. And that's a kind of closed communication process that's very narrow. And dialogue is the opposite, right? Dialogue is a process of listening to stories, of hearing stories, of hearing new things about people and new things about the issues that you're discussing, and oftentimes discovering new things about yourself. In dialogue, sessions, we suddenly think, wow, it didn't occur to me, but, that was important to my brother and I love him. And that's probably why I get triggered by that. So it is that kind of process of discovery, but it's very countercultural. I say, you can find it in AA meetings or Quaker meetings, or, there are spaces where people do sort of open up, and you have a facilitation or norms around sharing your story and listen to other stories in respectful ways. And those are powerful spaces, but they're pretty rare in our society. They're not something that's common, even at parties. Typically most of the time it is social comparison and competition and challenging your ideas. And that's what the internet's all about. Yeah. So it's just not something that we're trained in, exposed to very much, or is really valued enough in our society.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think in a way, my view of this is a lot of the polarization or a lot of the toxicity is it dehumanizes. And I mean that quite literally, is that it takes out the human component of things. If I look at someone that, is from a different part of the country than I am, and they have a different socioeconomic status, and they have a different, race and gender and all these things, for myself, there are many things that are different, but the thing that is the common thread there is that, well, we both are human beings. We both have, thoughts and feelings and intuitions, and we both have ostensibly families and people we care about, and we have communities, and those things are what connects many people. And even when there are great divides between us, the human aspect of us is the connecting point, and you can, I think, only reach the human through dialogue. You can't reach through argument or debate. Not to say that there isn't a place for those things, but and so I think a lot of this polarization that's pulling people politically, racially, et cetera, is the kind of dehumanizing component of that.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it is, you think about most of our media or news programs, right? Mm-hmm. The idea is you bring in people from, two sides of an issue. And many of these issues don't have two sides, they have 10 sides. If you're talking about immigration, there are so many different dimensions to the challenges and economic consequences and moral consequences of immigration and our history of it being an immigrant society. Mm-hmm. There's so much to unpack there. And yet we have, we boil it down to it's about building a wall or not building a wall. And, and that's what the conversation becomes about, which is absurd, and is not useful. And again, in journalism, reporters and journalists oftentimes think, well, we're bringing in the different sides of the argument, but there are oftentimes many arguments, and we're missing that sense and that understanding. And so we pit people against each other. They move into a debate like Bill Maher, and it's a screaming match, and off they go.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. So the one thing that you mentioned early on in the book is this idea of attractors. So maybe just explain to us that concept, and then that will lead into the bigger system.
Yeah, so I introduced or use the idea of attractors, which is just an idea out of science. It comes from actually applied mathematics, but attractors are simply, patterns that form in our life that become strong habits or strong containers. So addiction is a good example of an attractor. Addiction is a biopsychosocial structural problem. It means it starts to get into our neurological system and our chemical system. It's in our psychology. It's in the network of relationships we have. It's in the fact that we don't have a job and we're home a lot. The structures, they all sort of come together to create this pattern that draws us in, sucks us in. And that's what attractors are. So it might be, simply like your relationship with a brother or a sister. You may not see them for a year, but then you get back together, and your patterns are basically similar patterns to what you had when you were 8 years old, right? Right. And so there's no one reason why that happens. It's a constellation of things that over time, sort of grow in a relationship or in an addiction that lead to your attraction to those ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And I use this because, one of the reasons I wrote the book, as I mentioned, is that I felt like the science is misunderstood. Because when people write about polarization generally, particularly scientists, social scientists, we like to find the essence. We like to zoom in on the thing that we think matters the most. So we look at moral differences between red and blue Americans, or we look at differences in brain sensitivity to threat between, conservatives versus liberals, or we look at gerrymandering, or we look at the internet, or we look at, so we're always trying to seek the thing that matters the most in our estimation. And that's part of how we're trained as scientists. You're really trained to find the simplest possible answer to a phenomenon. But that does a misservice when we're in deeply embedded cultural patterns like toxic polarization that aren't determined by any one thing. They're determined by how a constellation of factors start to feed each other and reinforce each other in complex ways that create these patterns that we get sucked into. So, again, it might be that I decide, all right, I don't want to react to my neighbor, on the fifth floor, who I think is a, Trump jerk. I don't want to react to him anymore. And I just tell myself that. And then I find myself on the elevator and he said something about climate change and bam, I'm there, And so it's bigger than us in some ways. It's not just our attitudes or interactions. It's also how we're becoming hardwired, how our media feeds us, how, we read the news or avoid certain kinds of information. All of those things combine to create these, what I call landscapes of our life, that have these deep valleys that we can fall into. And those things are not created by any one thing. They're created by a constellation of things that work as like vicious cycles and create these patterns that we fall into.
Yeah, you mentioned when you began introducing the idea of attractors about the ideas of stability, durability, width, depth. What are those components and how they're really key for attractors and how we understand them?
Well, so attractors are kind of funny things. Remember, these are things that are studied in the lab or studied in, and attractors is an idea, again, it's like a metaphor that's used to study everything from cellular change. So people use attractors to understand how healthy cells flip very quickly into cancerous cells. It doesn't happen kind of slowly, incrementally over time, but you see this kind of qualitative change. But it's also that, people use attractors to study galaxy patterns and how galaxies form certain patterns. So it's a metaphor that's used a lot in science. And what scientists have done is they've tried to measure different aspects of attractors that help us make sense of them. So again, let me stick with addiction just because it's more familiar to people, but the deeper an addiction or the deeper an attractor for addiction, the more it's true that once you pick up and start using drugs, you fall in it and you can't get out because you're in a deep hole, basically, of attraction. right? The wider it is, the wider an attractor pattern is, then that means that even small marginal things that may have nothing to do with drug abuse to most people may trigger you. So it might be that you're walking down the street and you look up across the street and see a particular bodega that you used to go into to score, right? Mm-hmm. Triggers you and off you go. So the breadth, the depth, the shape of these attractors all influence basically how addictive they become in terms of patterns in our lives. And as I said, they're not shaped by any one thing, but some are much more pervasive in our life. And I would argue that toxic polarization today is a fairly pervasive phenomenon, because it's not just triggered when we sit down to have a formal debate with somebody. It's triggered when we see a tweet or we hear somebody make a comment on the street, and there we are.
Yeah, no, that's right. No, that's absolutely right. You mentioned, you can just briefly mention it because you say it many times in the book. Kurt Lewin, who's a big field theorist, and he came up with a whole kind of theory. Just kind of give us the 90-second version of that and how that applies to many of the things that you're discussing in the book.
Yeah, so he's considered by some the sort of forefather of social psychology. He was a German Jew that fled Nazi Germany in the 30s and came to America. And he was a very brilliant theorist, and he was trying to think about social relations. He was influenced by something called gestalt psychology, which again, in psychology, particularly before that, it used to be about mechanistic pieces, like looking at certain impulses that people would have and the effects of those impulses. The gestalts are more interested in trying to understand, how do people make sense of the world, the whole world? So as we're sitting and looking at each other, there's a lot of different stimulus coming at us, but how all of those things come together makes sense. So he was influenced by gestalt psychology, and he was influenced a lot by physics, and physics at the time was moving away from kind of Newtonian mechanics to something called field theory. Mm-hmm. Field theory argues that, again, what does matter is not just an interaction between two things, but the field of forces around them that are affecting them. So he used that when he came here and tried to study things like, the power of democratic leadership versus autocratic leadership, or he studied social conflict, he studied social justice and race relations. Mm-hmm. And he was interested always in the kind of constellation of things that affect, a relationship, a reaction. He wasn't looking, again, necessarily for the essence. He was trying to understand the constellation of forces. And that's, a precursor to complexity science. Mm-hmm. And my mentor, Morton Deutsch, was actually trained by Lewin, and then I worked more with Morton Deutsch. Wow. And again, they tended to be good systematic scientists that could actually do lab research and control certain things, but they always understood that you have to put it back into context, right? Mm-hmm. It might be that a certain belief drives you around, your religious orientation, but it also works in a context where sometimes that's really important and other times it's less important, right? Mm-hmm. So understanding the importance of the, force field or the context of things operating is central to how I think about these kinds of problems. And that goes back to Lewin.
Yeah, no, I also can recall studying him in grad school, and again, Gestalt theory and Gestalt psychology was influential for the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty, the therapy of Carl Rogers, various modernism in art. So this whole idea of the sum of the parts and how we understand things within context, and we get the holistic idea of things. It's just kind of zooming in and zooming out has a big ripple effect in many domains within the arts and humanities and social sciences and physical sciences.
Yeah, so absolutely.
Having that kind of backdrop, kind of get us into the 5 practices you lay out for solutions, right? So how do we could, spend hours literally talking about political polarization, much less, polarization with many things in the country and in different countries around the world. But what are the 5 ways? So it's if I have this right, reset, bolster, complicating, moving, and adapting. What are explain these, you can, I guess, just go in the order, and how this can help us kind of break out of this polarization for each of us.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I have to say that the story behind this is that when I decided to write this book, I went away for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks by myself and sat and basically mapped out everything that I thought needed to be said in order to, communicate with the public about what the problem is and what to do. And it was this highly immense, highly complicated set of interrelated things. It was a complex system, right? But then I realized, human beings really have a hard time making sense of those things, obviously, as I do. So the question is, how can I organize this in a way where there are a few things? And I ultimately landed on these 5 that can really help people that may make a difference in their life, in their behaviors, in their families, in their communities, scaling all the way up to, our nation or internationally. So I really cherry-picked 5 basic principles from science that help. Yeah. And so the first is, I use just the term reset, and I talk about the power of new beginnings. And this comes from, again, these are all derived from the study of complex systems and attractors, because part of what we find with attractor patterns, which are strong patterns, again, that are established in our relationships or in our own habits or in our communities. Part of what we've learned from that is that they're very sensitive to what complexity scientists call initial conditions, which means that, the very first time you meet somebody, the very first interaction you have, the first thing that you say or don't say, and vice versa, they're very formative processes that kind of move your experience of that individual and that relationship in a particular direction, right?
This is like these kind of first impressions you have upon meeting someone. You're saying it's setting kind of the tracks of which way we're gonna be going. That's
right. Yeah. So there's a psychologist in the West Coast named John Gottman. He and his wife have a big lab they call the Love Lab. They study marriages, and they find that when couples come in to talk about tensions that they have in their relationship, that the first 3 minutes, the temperature that they evidence, the attitudes and the emotions that they evidence in the first 3 minutes basically shape the emotional trajectory for the rest of the conversation. So how initially, part of it is how they come in. Do they come in with a grudge? Right, but then part of it is the first thing or two they say or do or don't do, and where that takes the conversation. And that just is an example of the sensitivity to initial conditions. So one of the things I emphasize in the book is that today, these days, great, COVID or slightly post-COVID, Black Lives Matter injustice, of, economic hardship for so many, opioid epidemic, we're under these, very destabilizing forces. And when you have a community, for example, that is highly destabilized by events like this, then they're oftentimes ripe for a reset. They're ripe to, ask ourselves. You see this in the fact that, there's, I think, 4 million people a month over the past several months have left their jobs, have decided to not go back to work or to change their careers. So this is a time where we're re-examining what's important, right? What we want to do with our life and our time and our families. And so this is a very ripe time for us to take our next step seriously. And that includes how we treat our neighbors, who we're willing to listen to and talk to, and ultimately how we perpetuate polarization and contempt, and ways we might mitigate it in our own lives. But it is important oftentimes for that kind of reset, that kind of, with addiction, it's that addicts hit rock bottom, right? They're so desperate, or their family intervenes and says, we're walking away from you unless you change. And it is that rock bottom time where they have to go through like an AA process where they do a searing inventory of, everything they've done in their life and reset and try to move in a radically different direction. So this chapter, which is on resetting, just speaks to the instability of our time, the value of that, and the need to make certain adjustments in our lives, particularly when we're, triggered to move into conflict. So people will call me, and say, all right, it's Thanksgiving. People are going to go back home. How should they have conversations at the Thanksgiving table? And my first question is, well, what do they want to do? Right? If you're going to go to Thanksgiving and you have a brother-in-law who is a diehard anti-Trumper, right? And he's going to start spouting that, or a Trumper, then the question is, what do you want? What do you want out of that conversation? Do you want to just humiliate them and shame them and, escalate things as you usually do? And if you do, if that's what you want, have at it. Go ahead, have your fun, but realize that it's going to go down the same path that it always goes down. If what you ask yourself is, what do I want? And you realize that this is a toxic relationship and it's messing up my family and it's ruining Thanksgivings or it's ruining holidays. We need to somehow figure out a different way to do this. If that's really what you want to do, then you have to sort of approach that conversation in a very different way. These are the kinds of, in some ways, small resets that can help us start to ask ourselves, what do we want to do and how do we do that? And not just being reactive to, comments and topics that come up. For some, I would suggest don't talk politics in Thanksgiving. Just decide not to do that. If you want to say to your brother-in-law, Saturday, let's take a walk. You and I will go for a walk and we can talk about whatever you want, and whatever policy stuff you want to talk about, we'll talk about it then. Let's have Thanksgiving. Let's watch some football. Let's have some dinner and turkey, So again, it's being more intentional, but it's recognizing that more of the same of the runaway train that we're stuck on is just going to get us, and more intense and alienating kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you say in this part is how we check our assumptions and our intentions, which is what you're getting at here, which I think is super important for people to do. But I find that for various reasons, that's hard for people to do. It's either they're not incentivized enough, or there's too much of the reactionary piece, or they feel very justified in their strong positions, or very passionate. And I think this is really hard for folks. And so I like the way you said it there, was, many times I see this all over the spectrum, is that people are terribly reactionary to things, right? I can, I'll get online and I'll see just people, it's almost predictable, right? Something will happen, some micro thing in the week that, someone keeps passing and sharing that video over and over and over. And I'll see literally almost in real time, the divide, right? I just see it popping up all over my feed, and everyone has this side's take and this side's take, and everybody's engaging in it. And I always ask myself, why? Like, not everybody needs to have a take or a reaction. You can notice it, you can roll your eyes, you can say yes or whatever internally and move on. Not everyone needs to know it. And I think it's partly because, again, going back to that reward of sorts, that whoever's on your side is going to reward that. And so I find that, so that's one thing online, but I think in person, it doesn't do quite the same, but it's hard for people, I think, to really check their intentions or assumptions. And so I think you're right in saying, look, is the person more important? Is celebrating a family holiday more important than having some kind of debate? And maybe you block off some time to do that if you want, one-on-one, but what's the most important thing? And I think that's hard for some people to really do even that bit of it, to just say, well, what do I want out of this? A lot of people, they're just kind of going with it. Well, I just have to go to Thanksgiving or Christmas or New Year's, and I'm just going to be there and we'll see what happens. But I think if people are a little more intentional, they can have a different way of interacting with others.
I agree completely. I think you're right that it is a very difficult thing these days. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, in fact, outrage and the taste for retaliation is in and of itself an addictive substance. It's a property. They find that in brain research that what's triggered in your brain when you feel an outrage and you want to retaliate, the same parts of your brain fire as when you take narcotics. So there's a core element to that. But we're also all at a time where people are exhausted. It's been almost 2 years of COVID and fear and the Trump's election and the vitriol and the news and the media and Facebook is, addicting us in different ways, and the Apple phones are addicting us in new ways. We're a highly stressed society. There was a study that came out a few days ago, I think it was in Science, that looked at data over 6 years in Western Europe. And what they found is that when temperatures got extreme, either more cold or much more warm than typical, that they saw a spike in hate and vitriol on Twitter, right? So when humans become exhausted and fed up and there's pressure, there's stress on us, we become our less, worse angels, right? And so the context is such where most of us are easily triggered. I see it all the time. I hear it. My neighbors are hollering. I see it at work. People who usually get along well enough aren't, it's a very difficult time. And we're being triggered constantly, intentionally by the internet, by news, by journalism, by various different sources. So of course it's difficult for us. I think recognizing, that's kind of the beauty of AA is AA sort of says, this is bigger than me. I can't do it alone. I need to find other people that can kind of help me do it, right? There's a recognition that there's something operating here that is beyond my will. And so recognizing that is this first step to saying, okay, help me out here, right? Help me out with what I need to not do and do. And the first step is, what are your intentions?
Yeah. I totally agree with you, and you carry that on into the second practice, the bolster practice, right? And so you talk about what are some ways in which we can weaken our worst tendencies, right? Leveraging ruptures, reducing resistance to change, increasing repellers. So what are the ways in which we could do that, and what are some things that get in the way of allowing people to do that?
Yeah. Right. So, and that's, again, so much of this book is about how to change these patterns that we're stuck in. Right.
Yeah.
And when you're stuck in a pattern, oftentimes, what we find in all kinds of interventions, psychological interventions, humanitarian interventions, peace building interventions abroad, that having, sort of a new solution, some shiny new object come in and say, here's what you need to do, is not helpful. What's usually the most helpful is to go into community and say, well, who's already doing good work here? Where is it's a concept in organizational science called positive deviance. It's like, who locally is actually being pretty resilient, pretty constructive, bringing people together. So I say to people in very simple terms, is there somebody in your life, in your family, in your community, a friend, who is a kind of natural mediator or peacemaker, and when something gets bad and you're at a bar and you're having conversations with friends and something gets really heated, they're the one that says, let's sit down for a second. What are we doing? Let's get back to a conversation that we can all have. There are those people in most of our lives. And there's a website called the Bridging Divides Initiative, which is a website out of Princeton. It's a map of the U.S. If you click on it, you can see in your community where the bridge building groups are, and where are there organizations that are bringing either red and blues together or people across racial divisions or religious divisions. There are thousands of these across the country that are set up to have conversations that are useful to people. So my recommendation is, if you're trying to have a conversation with somebody and you keep getting stuck and you keep escalating, then find somebody or some group to help you do that. Because there are people, even today, under these kinds of circumstances, that are actively refining how to do that and doing it well, and working with them again, I keep going back to the metaphor of AA. It is like going to a meeting. If you're triggered by something and you're an addict, you find a meeting, right? You reach out to your sponsors. You say to somebody, I need your help. I need to go to a group. I need to talk about what's going on with me, share it, hear how other people manage this. And these bridge building organizations or individuals in our life are a parallel to that. They're good people that are trying to bring the temperature down. They're trying to grow the moderate middle and re-engage us. And those are gold in times like this. You want to just find where they are in case you need them.
Yeah, it's really kind of trying to build a network of people that are able to kind of give you a net to maneuver, which, leads to the third point, which is, complexity. And, so there's two things here. This is the one I wanted to ask you about the most, because I see, and it kind of makes sense if you think about it. So many people resist complexity. They really resist this. I encountered this. I know many other people that encounter this, where if you do it politically, people on the left, people on the right, they love reductionistic arguments. Everything, all the problems of the world, we can narrow it all the way down and funnel all the way down to this one or two constructs, right? Yeah. All sides do this. And if you don't agree with that, or if you try and do nuance, or if you're one of these milquetoast moderate centrists, you're part of the problem too, right? Yeah. You're not taking it serious. You're not passionate enough. And right. So the fact remains that people are really complicated, and the world is really complicated, not because, you want it to be that way, or because I want it to be that way. It is that way. Most problems have multivariate elements and need multivariate solutions, right? That's the fact of life. Yeah. And when people try to do these reductionistic kind of solutions or arguments, some of it may be valid, but it is turning a blind eye to many of the other things. And so when people try to kind of build out from the middle, or from moderate to, you're not dreaming big, you're not being bold enough, it's not grand enough, or many of these other things. And so how do we really, at an individual level, and then scale it to systems in terms of state governments, federal governments, how do we really get this kind of middle out nuance complexity? Because that does get some kind of resistance a lot of times.
No, again, you're right. It's look, our world is immensely complex. The biology of the world we live in, the geography of the world we live in, the culture that we live in, the technologies effects in it. Yeah. Immensely complicated time. Yeah. It is an overwhelming time for people. And when people, again, are under stress, under pressure, we tend to simplify things, right? Mm-hmm. When they're coming for us, we want to know, are you with me or against me? Right. It's simple, right? Right. So under certain kinds of conditions, it's much harder to do this. But I would say complexity of all things is a three bears problem, right? You can have complexity, you can have premature simplification, right? It's this or that, right? Mm-hmm. Or you can get lost in the overwhelming amount of things that affect thing. And conservatives and liberals tend to do those things. So liberals are all about the context of chronic poverty and racism, and the context is driving things. It's a very complex thing. Mm-hmm. And conservatives will say, nope, it's the individual. It's your character. It's it's your rights. Right. And so and of course they're both right to some degree.
Yes, they're both right for sure. 100%. Yeah.
There's some combination of both, but it's very difficult, again, particularly under attack or threat or debate, to keep a more nuanced understanding. But I think what's important to recognize is that when conflicts like political conflicts today escalate, our tendency is to simplify. We simplify them and their intentions. They're all alike. We simplify our group. We're all fantastic. We simplify the issues into things like the wall. It's immigration, but no, it's really the wall, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's our tendency, then the things that we can do to help fight that tendency, whether we're on the left or the right, is to reintroduce some modicum of complexity. So a simple thing I do which, so when an event breaks, when something's happening, I will intentionally flip back and forth to different kinds of news sources to kind of get some sense of how are things being reported or not reported. But more importantly, what I try to do is I've identified, a handful of people in my life who I think are very smart, well-intentioned, well-informed conservatives that differ politically from me on many issues, but that I respect for their thinking. So I don't follow Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson, and I've avoided even Rachel Maddow and people on the left that I think sometimes go too far. What I try to do is find people that I think are reasonable. And what that means is that you don't want to listen to everybody. First of all, it's impossible. And second of all, it's confusing and it's too irritating. But you do want to identify people that will challenge you. There's a great body of research on something called super forecasting that comes from Philip Tetlock. Right. And Tetlock studies people that are actually really good at predicting the future. And one of the things he finds is something that he calls integrative complexity, which he's studied for most of his career, which is that they tend not to be specialists in one thing. They tend to be very curious people that go down different kinds of paths, and they have sort of eclectic networks of people that will disagree with them, right? So if they have an idea about something, they'll put it out there and somebody will say, well, that's inane, or this is what I think, or actually I support you. They get a lot of different kinds of feedback when they're making their decisions, and they make much better decisions than those of us that are just comfortable having people say to us, oh, you're brilliant, that's fantastic, So it does require a kind of tolerance for ambiguity and ability to sit with, sometimes confusing information. But if we can do that, we get better information. We're less reactionary because we know people, on different sides of an issue who are decent people and thoughtful people about those things. So there are, again, and what I, as try to do in the book is talk about the principle like reintroduce contradictory complexity and show how you can do that in your life, in your family, in your community, and so sort of scales up. Botswana did it with a policy about moving when they first became an independent nation and they were afraid of slipping into ethnic war. They made this policy where they moved people around a lot to have contact with each other, which complicates their life because you can't just grow up and live in the same place. But if you're a civil servant, which is, I think, a third or 40% of the workforce there, you're required every 7 years to move to a different part of the country and grow up with a different ethnic group and spend time there and be an ambassador and meet them. And that kind of movement and complexity introduced into life makes it one of the most peaceful nations in Africa. And it's a nation that got independence at the same time Mozambique did and Angola did, who immediately broke into war. So, these ideas about the importance of complexity and how we think, feel, and where we live scale.
Yeah, that reminds me of some of the work the anthropologists and historians do about nomadic cultures. They have a very peculiar and specific way of creating hierarchy and organization, and how they're able to have large periods of peace with others. Because I think partly because of that, when you're cycling through and interacting with different people, and you have this kind of nomadic nature within you, the world looks a little different. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the last two, move and adapt, kind of briefly touch on those.
Yeah. So movement is, this I thought was one of the most provocative things in terms of peace building in my field of conflict resolution, because our whole, bread and butter is based on getting people to come together, sit down at a table, opposite one another and talk. And most of the time, that's a really good process and can be very helpful, particularly if you need a mediator that can kind of set up guidelines and norms that make it work or help it work. But when you have conflicts like today, these kind of highly polarized things that basically are embedded now in our neurological structures. So we can't process certain information. We intentionally process other kinds of information, and that's in our neurological networks. then under those conditions, we may need more help than just sitting at a table and talking to each other. And what neuroscience is suggesting is that one of the things that helps is movement. So for me to get up and walk and think and draw on a big board starts to even free me up individually. But if you get two people who are opposed to an issue actually walking together side by side, ideally outside, ideally in nature, where you're sort of viewing the same kind of, setting past you, it tends to connect us even physiologically, like neurologically, you get in sync. And it does tend to promote feelings of cooperation and compassion and empathy for one another that can be useful if you're stuck. Right. So that's why I said, if your brother-in-law, say, let's go for a walk, because it's kind of a secret weapon if your objective is to get out of the us, them, screaming matches and get into a different kind of place where you can start to share some experiences and share some stories. Physical movement, research suggests, is one way to give us a leg up on that.
Yeah. And the adapt piece?
So the adapt piece is really about the hard truth that these kinds of conflicts are hard. They take time. Americans are impatient. We like quick fixes for things. We like technical fixes. And the reality is this set of divisions that is multi-layered, driven by multi-layered drivers, has been accumulating for decades. So the idea that Joe Biden's going to come in and unite us is not only ridiculous, but it's never going to happen, and it's just going to frustrate us. Yeah. We have to recognize that if we want to escape this trap, it's going to take time. I mean, look at addiction. Addiction is a lifelong process. Once you have addiction, recovery takes forever. It's not something that you check off and you're out.
You always have to bake into that if you take the stages of change, the kind of sixth one, which is relapse. It's going to happen. It's going to happen at some point, and it's not a failure. It's a part of the kind of the process. And that happens. So
absolutely, being triggered and failing and trying to do good and then backing up is part of the journey. And so what that chapter is an attempt to say is, look, this is not an easy road. We're in a difficult place. We're in the 1850s. We're trying to avoid a civil war on our streets. So there's good reason to engage with it, but there aren't quick fixes. There are things that we can do today that can help us and help our families and communities. And I encourage that. But you have to anticipate that there will be setbacks. There will be frustrating things that happen. You will get triggered and slide back. And you have to sort of put your eye on the long-term prize of where you're trying to go, and how important it is to sort of stay in the fight or stay in the journey. And that's essentially what ADAPT is sort of suggesting, is that it's not about solving a problem. It's about recognizing the nature of the problem, which in and of itself morphs. As technologies change, suddenly there's a new platform and it's even more addictive, but even more popular. And so we have to, learn to adapt with the changing nature of our culture, and be able to tolerate that.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the research in psychology, whether it's evolutionary psychology or some of the clinical work now, is showing that we understand how big of a role cooperation is for humans. And so while it may seem antithetical to fight kind of our groupish nature or our tribal instincts, we also have literally embedded within our body, and then within our kin, and then with our fellow communities and fellow humans around the world, this idea of cooperation. That's how we've succeeded on the planet for as long as we have. And so I do think it is possible. My biggest worry is how scale. How do we scale this? I can do this one-on-one with people. I can do this with folks in my neighborhood, etc. But how do we scale it? And I think that's always the $64,000 question. And so, I guess the last question I have for you here is what do you expect or want folks that read your book to kind of take away from it? What do you want them to get out of it, and how can they chart the way out forward?
Well, I've been accused of being an optimist, which is interesting given how I start the book, right?
Right.
But I do hope that people leave with a sense of hope and possibility. I end with some quotes from Mandela and John Lewis, I couldn't remember, right? That do speak about hopeful times and the importance of perseverance under difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
I guess what I will say is, if you go to the Bridging Divides Initiative website, you see that there are somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 community-based groups across the country that are doing this work. So you're not alone.
Yeah.
There are people all over the place, probably in your community, that you can reach out to and have conversations with. Even if you don't join, just reach out and get a sense of what are you doing and do you know if does it work? How do you know? Start those conversations. That's where the hope is, that there is so much good work happening, and it's happening within Congress, and it's happening within journalism, and it's happening within business. There are, bridge building initiatives happening everywhere. We need to know that and recognize that, because there's hope in that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Well, the book is called The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. Peter, this was fantastic. I had a really good time talking with you, and I could keep talking to you for many more hours, but I want to respect your time. So I appreciate you so much. Where can people find you, and best place to get the book and all that good stuff?
So there's a website for the book called The Way Out. It's called thewayoutofpolarization.com, which is a long word. But on the website, there's a bunch of media and interviews and talks and all kinds of stuff that you can peruse to give you a taste of it. And then you can order the book. It's on Amazon. It's on, basically all the major platforms. So, so it's pretty accessible, but that's the easiest way in.
Okay, that's great. And again, thanks so much. This was such a blast. I really enjoy these kind of conversations and talking to people that are trying to find pragmatic solutions to some of this hard stuff instead of just complaining about it. So I really did enjoy the conversation. I appreciate it.
Right.